All right, welcome to the Washington History Seminar, to the Wilson Center, to this jointly sponsored event, sponsored by the National History Center, an initiative of the American Historical Association, and the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center that I run at our end, and I'm of course delighted to welcome my co-chair, Professor Roger Lewis, here, and we're especially delighted to welcome Professor Linda Kerber here for this week's installment with a presentation on statelessness in the 20th century, in 20th century America. Before we introduce her, let me quickly just acknowledge, as always, the generous support by the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, for Schaefer, for co-sponsoring this event and giving us a little bit of a budget to be able to get you all some coffee and a little bit of wine and cheese after the event. Unfortunately, not a whole lot more at the moment. Funders are welcome if anybody would like to step forward. We're still looking for a major endowment for this event because, in fact, all of our presenters are coming here to speak without an honorarium, on a very small budget, and often, most of the times, without us being able to support travel expenses either. So we're absolutely delighted to have one of the leading this country's leading historians with us today, and a past president of the American Historical Association. Linda Kerber is the May Brodbeck Professor of History at the University of Iowa. Many of you are familiar with her work on the history of citizenship, gender, and authority. Let me just mention a couple of key moments in her biography. She is an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and a fellow of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. As mentioned, she served as president of the Organization of American Historians in 1996 and 1997, and as president of the American Studies Association in 1988. She was also the Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University. She has served on numerous editorial boards and as historical advisor to several museum exhibitions. She is advisory editor to the Gender and American Culture series of the University of North Carolina Press, and on the editorial board of Science, a journal of women and culture and society. Of course, she has numerous publications to her credit. She is the author of No Constitutional Right to Be Ladies, Women, and the Obligations of Citizenship, for which she was awarded the Littleton Griswold Prize for the best book in U.S. legal history, and the Joan Kelly Prize for the best book in women's history. Among her other books, just to name a couple, Toured an Intellectual History of Women, Women of the Republic, Intellect and Ideology in Revolutionary America, and Federalists in Dissent, Imagery and Ideology in Jeffersonian America. As I said, we're absolutely thrilled to have her with us today, and it's a great pleasure to give her the floor. But first turn it over to Roger for some additional introductory remark and getting us started on our usual rite of introductions.
It is a great pleasure to have Linda Kerber with us this afternoon. There is a full contingent from the American Historical Association, not only the present executive director, but the past executive director, and even the legal counsel. The legal counsel occasionally comes to meetings of the seminar, but this is the first time that he's lent his full support by actually sitting at the seminar table. We do have a, and I forgot to mention that we even have a graduate student from the University of Texas. So this seminar continues to expand. We do have a ritual in which we simply go around the table and ask everyone to introduce himself, your institutional affiliation, or whatever else happens to be on your mind. We will begin with the executive director.
Jim Grossman, I'm the executive director of the American Historical Association, and we don't have time for me to discuss what's on my mind.
David Kyvig. I was at a meeting in New York last Tuesday at which the absence of Linda Kerber was remarked upon and regretted immensely. It was a gathering of progressives, civil rights activists who are thinking about how to overturn Citizens United and pursue other similar agendas, and they much regretted that your counsel was not available to them.
Hi, my name's Erin Cousins of Late of the University of Hawaii at Manoa's PhD program in history, and I just started at the Office of the Historian at State Department.
Arnita Jones, Executive Director Emerita from the AHA, with much less on my mind these days than Jim.
Anna Nelson, History Department, American University.
Don Wolfensberger, I'm directing a Congress seminar series on global challenges here at the Wilson Center.
James Sang, IBM Research Emeritus, and between the ages of 3 and 9, for me, my parents were stateless citizens.
Eric Arneson from George Washington University and a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
Jim Banner. I think it's probably appropriate for me to point out that a few years ago, Linda and I were graduate student mates on Morningside Heights, where we studied with, under, in the same room as Richard Hofstadter. What's the preposition, Linda? And we also hazed each other, laughed with each other, groaned with each other, suffered bouts of anxieties, helping each other through our general examinations at Columbia. I've known her for a long time.
And therefore, we don't take each other very seriously.
Well, that's not entirely true, as you know.
Sometimes too seriously.
Dorothy Ross. I'm Emerita at Johns Hopkins University and a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. And I could go through a long history with Linda, but I'll spare you.
I'm Monique Laney. I'm the AHA NASA Fellow in Aerospace History right now.
Hi, I'm Roger Lanius. I'm a senior curator at the National Air and Space Museum.
Paul Foreman, a curator at the Museum of American History.
City Sudhir, American Historical Association.
Albert Beveridge, and I'm the lawyer in the room.
There are two.
I'm Dick Kerber. I'm Linda's husband. I am a professor of medicine at the University of Iowa. And given who I am, I have a passionate interest in history. So I'm the ultimate consumer of what so many of you write so well.
Philippa Strom, I'm a resident senior scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Landis Jones, political science professor emeritus at University of Louisville.
Bob Whitaker, I'm a graduate student in history at UT Austin. I'm writing my dissertation on the history of Interpol.
I'm Kenton Clymer, Northern Illinois University, and I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Marley Clymer. I'm a retired nurse.
I'm Robert Baum. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center, and I teach in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Missouri.
I'm Marion Barber, the Associate Director of the National History Center.
I'm Gary Peterson, the other lawyer in the room. That's all right. I'm hiding behind you. I'm a big fan of Linda's.
I'm Arlen Charles. I'm at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Good afternoon. Maureen Lynch, recently affiliated with an NGO, Refugees International, here in Washington, and currently affiliated with the International Observatory on Statelessness, based out of Kingston University, UK.
Hello, I'm Miriam Rurup from the German Historical Institute and working on a history of statelessness, comparing the German and the US-American approach to finding solutions on statelessness. Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Jan Lamberts. I work at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum down the street.
Ruth Greenspan Bell, lawyer.
I'm Al Schmidt. I'm a retired professor in history and law, and I'm presently at GW.
I have to say, I'm most impressed. I don't think we have had a seminar in our 2-year run where we had such an ideal spread of institutions represented here at the center. This is precisely what Roger and I had in mind when we originally started up the seminar. So it's great to see everybody. Roger, any final introductory remarks? Otherwise, we'll turn
only to introduce Linda, Statelessness in 20th Century America.
Well, thank you all. I'm really delighted to be here. Let's see how I adjust. Let's make sure this microphone is doing what it's supposed to do and not getting in my way. So I am delighted to be here. I'm honored by the warm introductions that Christian and Roger have given me. I have the feeling that I should quit while I'm ahead and leave now. I'm honored by the number of people who've come today and the range of your interests. I do have a global challenge for us, and I'm humbled by the many people in this room who know far more about statelessness than I do, either by experience or by work like Maureen Lynch's over the course of many, many years of lobbying and working on behalf of refugees and the stateless, and from whom I have learned a great deal. I know that Miriam Erup would want me, because you haven't identified the conference at the German Historical Institute. Do you want to say just its name, because I may bungle it?
Yes, hold on. We need microphone, otherwise this event is being webcast, so otherwise we can't capture it. Okay.
We are organizing a conference at the German Historical Institute that's going to take place in February, and Linda Kerber is one of our guests and participants at the conference, and the title is Living on the Margins, Illegality, Deportation, and Statelessness in the 20th Century.
Thank you. I would have mangled it. And before I begin, I want also to recommend to you a new book that Maureen Lynch edited with Brad Blitz of the UK called Statelessness and Citizenship. And I commend it to you. I commend also to you a book called Children Without a State, a Global Human Rights Challenge that was published last spring by MIT Press, edited by Jacqueline Baba of the Kennedy School at Harvard. I have an essay in the latter. I merely wrote a blurb for Maureen's book, but now you have your recommended reading. And as Jim will remember, Richard Hofstadter used to say that a graduate student is an adult with a reading list, and so now you have all been catapulted back into your graduate student days. The subject of statelessness is one that it took me a long time to find my way to, which surprises me because, as Christian told you, I had spent a good bit of my time thinking about citizenship as experienced in the United States, particularly about citizenship as distinctively experienced by women. So one would think that since the flip of citizenship is the absence of citizenship, the absence of a nationality, that it would have been an easy shift for me. But those who know me know that I took an awfully long time to find my way into a subject which has come for me to be of consuming interest. And to my great dismay, suddenly a subject of consuming interest to this country, to its policymakers, and to its politicians. I need not remind you, I suspect, that only in the summer of 2010, the deportation of thousands of Roma from France dramatize the vulnerability of those who lack a secure nationality. Some of you will remember the story broken by Nina Bernstein in the New York Times last August of Antonio Bravo, who has no claim to asylum in Britain and is on the verge of being deported to Angola, where his father, from which his father had fled, carrying Antonio with him as a small child. His father had fled because he, the father, had been an organizer of pro-democracy movement in Angola. The father, threatened with deportation, committed suicide in Britain some years ago, and now Britain is seeking to deport Antonio. 2 weeks ago, India and Bangladesh, though it was in the New York Times less than a week ago, Tuesday. It was a Tuesday. It's either last Tuesday or the Tuesday before. The New York Times ran a story telling us that India and Bangladesh had just agreed to develop an agreement about the status of some 50,000 people who sometimes are called Bihari but do not like that title, who were caught between India and East Pakistan when that was split, and when Bangladesh was formed, were left out of the nationality of both countries. So now, finally, they are beginning to promise that a nationality will be invented for those people. And here in the United States, the startling introduction of the once unthinkable possibility of undermining the 14th Amendment by reframing it so that only some children born in the United States will be citizens at birth carries with it the threat of radically increasing statelessness in the United States, a problem that Americans have long believed belonged to other persons, other nations, other times, other people's histories, Jews in Nazi Germany, gypsies, Palestinians. Not us, we said, not us. And yet, it is here, I believe, on our plate, and I think we need to think about it very, very hard. Only last May, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a vote, a tie vote, and because it was a tie vote, because it was a per curiam decision, it was unaccompanied by an opinion, and so will not get the attention that I believe it deserves. In the case of Flores Villar versus the United States, a case which raises a question about the birthright citizenship of children born to American nationals overseas. And I want, at the end of this period, to say a few words about that. In that case, both sides agreed that preventing statelessness is an important government objective of utmost import, but disagreed on how best to protect non-marital children born abroad to U.S. citizen parents. So the subject is no longer one of primarily academic significance to be contemplated at our leisure. A range of policy choices now rests upon it. I should say that when I first started to work on this subject, which was when I was preparing my AHA presidential address, which was given at the beginning of 2007, so I'm working on it in 2005, 2006, I found that books that I took out of the library that were useful to me in thinking about this had been last stamped out in 1948, 1952, 1958, and then they stopped stamping. And you all know that the barcode system did not get developed until the 1990s. So one can conclude that if they still had the stamped pages in the checkout list, that book had sat quietly on the shelves for a long time, because before World War II, during World War II, in its early aftermath, statelessness was indeed a major problem throughout the world. And that those books were regarded as antiquarian and not useful and not necessary seemed to me a wonderful thing. But now when people ask me in elevators, you know, the elevator conversation, can you say what you're working on in 2 minutes? And when they ask me what I'm working on and I tell them, they say, oh, how interesting. They say, that is fascinating. They say, are undocumented Mexicans stateless? They ask me about their mothers. They ask me about their fathers. And I find it, I have to say, demoralizing and very, very sad. This is not a subject that I wish had contemporary purchase. Although, of course, usually the dream of a historian is that people will regard what you say as not merely antiquarian. We don't have a lot of time today. I want to introduce you to some of the pieces of this project, some things that I've been thinking about lately that relate to it, that I am working on hard now. They are subjects, particularly the major one, about which I know far less than I want to, and for which I believe there are people in this room who can help me. So I offer this not as a paper of my conclusions, but very much as work in progress, and you are to treat me for all of that glorious introduction as a very beginning graduate student. I am in your camp. I never before worked in 20th century archival materials. I never worked in the materials of the State Department. I am in great debt to Erin Cousins, who has been helping me like Diogenes with a lantern make some sense of this stuff, but I do not flatter myself that I know very much. When I wrote the presidential address in 2006, 2007, I was looking for nodes of the U.S. experience where statelessness figures and identified, maybe 8 spaces in the American narrative in which it mattered. The first and obvious one was slaves were stateless. Native Americans at various times and places were stateless. And as some of you perhaps don't know, because I can stop whole rooms full of attorneys in their tracks by saying this, and it is something they didn't teach us at Columbia when we were studying constitutional history, and they should have. Throughout much of the 19th century, deep into the 20th, not fully fixed till the late 40s, early 50s, when an American-born woman married a foreign-born man, she lost her citizenship at marriage. That loss was stabilized by statute and by a Supreme Court opinion in 1915. And since she lost it at marriage, then she was exposed. If her husband's nation did not instantly embrace her as a citizen, she was exposed to statelessness. And so when people see the similar kinds of laws and practices alive in the Middle East today, they should be bitter, skeptical, and angry, but they should not be holier than thou, because it is not that long ago that the same similar assumptions held sway in the United States. When I gave that talk, however, I did not speak, had not done any research on the space in the U.S. historical narrative in which statelessness as a problem for the United States was most obvious. And that is, of course, the era of World War II and its immediate aftermath, when refugees, many of them stateless, flooded to the United States. And I did not do that then because I think I have 2 paragraphs mentioning it, because I thought that was an issue that most people knew, and I was seeking to identify spaces to which they had not paid much attention. But now I'm paying attention. And paying attention to what happened in the 50s seems to me to be very, very interesting, and that is what I want to spend the bulk of my time on now. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in December of 1948, asserts in Article 15 that everyone has a right to a nationality. In Article 14, that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And in Article 13, that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. It is difficult, I think, now to recapture how powerful, how radical these provisions were at the time. Debates over their precise wording were extensive. They made it into the final text only over the resistance of the Soviet bloc. In light of the abysmal failure of the League of Nations to halt extensive denationalizations by the Soviet Union, Germany, and Italy in the interwar years, René Cassin, the French member of the Human Rights Commission, had hoped to include a clause in the in the Universal Declaration to the effect that it is the duty of the United Nations and member states to prevent statelessness as inconsistent with human rights and the interests of the human community. He never got that sentence in. But he was confident that the principles that they did articulate would contribute something, and now I'm quoting, quite new. The individual has become, for the first time, the subject of international law in respect of life and liberty. These were three international rights to which no national or international authority has hitherto been able to proclaim, let alone enforce. He spoke at a time when the forced displacements before and during World War II and the Cold War turned uncountable numbers of people into refugees. An estimated 7 to 11 million for Europe alone, millions more in India, Pakistan, and in the Middle East. And in a spot to which I am surprised that Americans have paid so little attention, in the Far East, where the 1910 annexation of Korea by Japan had made Koreans into Japanese subjects. Male Koreans after 1910 could establish, didn't all, but they had an option, an ability to establish residency in Japan, and had been granted some of the rights of citizens, including the right to vote and run for office. When in defeat, Japan lost its overseas empire, Koreans in Japan were denationalized by the Japanese government. Their nationality was listed as Korean. But Japan did not establish diplomatic ties with Korea until 1965. Denaturalized Koreans had no effective nationality. And even today, denationalized Koreans who have not formally reclaimed, in Japan, who have not formally reclaimed their Korean citizenship remain subject to passport and visa restrictions. To this development, the occupying United States paid virtually no attention. Americans counted themselves largely free of this concern. As I've said, the 14th Amendment's majestic first clause, all persons are born or who are born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. Establishing birth on U.S. soil is central to citizenship and has for long been understood to be at the heart of the Constitution. It incorporates the liberties listed in the Bill of Rights as binding on the federal government. Congress shall make no law into the responsibilities of state governments, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. I should say as an aside that whenever I teach, whatever I teach, whatever the title of the course is, I find an excuse to require all students to memorize the first section of the 14th Amendment. And I commend that strategy to you. The law students, I have an adjunct appointment in the law school, and the law students didn't like the assignment until I told them the story that you may all know, that Thurgood Marshall was an obstreperous high school student, and for punishment, he liked to tell the story. His teacher kept him after school, and each time she kept him after school, she made him memorize another sentence of the Constitution, so that by the time Thurgood Marshall had graduated from high school, he knew the Constitution cold. And if it was good enough for Thurgood Marshall, they could darn well learn the first clauses of the 14th Amendment. And I make them do it because so much of our civil liberties decisions, so much of our litigation hinges on one or another piece of that opening section, and because if you stop the average person in the street, whether it's the students in Iowa City or a random person on, outside here, I bet you they will say that these rights redound to citizens, and I want them to have memorized that the promise is to all persons. In the United States, then, after the war, routes to naturalization seemed relatively easy. Statelessness seemed to most Americans to be somebody else's problem. But it was a big problem, and as you know, in the face of a post-war economic recession and a fierce congressional hostility to Jewish immigration, Truman was reduced to doing what he could by executive order, reserving to displaced persons half the quotas already in place for immigrants from Europe. Only in 1948, after much legislative struggle, did Congress authorize the admission of some 200,000 over and above immigrant quotas. Even then, State Department dragged its heels, understanding themselves, as Roger Daniels, the historian, put it, to be gatekeepers whose function was to protect America from foreign contagion. Among those admitted, only 15% were Jewish, most of whom were stateless. There were other stateless from Eastern Europe. So here I am trying to figure out what's going on here. If we want to understand the struggles to transform the future of stateless people in the post-war world, we need to go to Lake Success outside of New York City and follow along to the skyscraper on 42nd Street and follow the work of the United Nations Economic and Social Council's committees and commissions. The Universal Declaration, which I've spent some time elaborating in those glorious sentences, glorious clauses, had no enforcement mechanism. It is a text that one authority called artificial to the point of flippancy. And yet this is a world full of desperate refugees who had no way of claiming a nationality, who sought to change their nationality, who sought asylum. In an effort to give the principle some traction, first we have the Secretary General providing a report on statelessness and then appointing an ad hoc committee on refugees and stateless persons, which was charged with developing a convention that could be signed by member states. The committee began to meet in January of 1950. By the fall, they had completed a draft, and the following year, the draft became a convention. For a long time, and this is why it doesn't figure in that presidential address, I assumed that these conventions and the ones that followed it, specifically about statelessness, was not part of my story. Not part of my story because the United States did not sign or ratify the Convention on Refugees of 1951 or the Convention relating to the status of stateless persons of 1954 or the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness in 1961. It used to be hard to reconstruct a world in which the American Bar Association took the position that the Declaration of Human Rights should not be accepted by the United States, in which the United States refused to sign the statelessness conventions. But alas, that world is all too much more easily imagined now in our political climate. And in the poisoned political climate of the mid-1950s, American conservatives insisted that even the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration undermined American legal tradition. In this story, we turn to a young lawyer named Louis Henkin. And if there's anyone in this room who knew him, he died only last winter, I would love to talk to you about this. Is there anyone here who knew him or studied with him? He was a young lawyer in the Department of Regional Affairs at the State Department. Regional Affairs then included NATO and the United Nations. And as Henkin remembered it, it was a chance assignment that deployed him to represent the United States on that ad hoc committee. The State Department, he said in an oral history, wanted someone to represent the U.S. there, and they never had any intention of signing it or ratifying it. And the guy who was the head of the division at the time said to me, "You're a lawyer. Why don't you represent the United States?" And I was to tell them, as far as I know, the United States has no intention of signing that convention. Henkin was an unusual guy. As a child of 6 or 7, he had immigrated with his family from present-day Belarus. He graduated from Yeshiva College and then from Harvard Law School in 1940. His 4 years in the Army, where he won a Silver Star for service in Germany, were bracketed by clerkships, the first with Learned Hand and the second with Justice Felix Frankfurter. When he left Frankfurter's office, he worked briefly in the UN legal department, and so he came to his own rich understanding of the promises of the United Nations and the agenda of those who sought to undermine the establishment of this body. When he joined the State Department, he was 33 years old. He is a kid. For all the easy dismissiveness of his supervisors, the U.S. had a lively interest in the shape of these developments. And having read the oral history, I was stunned to discover when I read the travaux préparatoires, the minutes of those deliberations, that Henkin was talking from the very first hour. He had a lot to say. Not signing did not mean that the State Department did not care how the convention turned out. There were going to be domestic political consequences. Although it was a year before the Bricker Amendment was introduced, there was already a free-floating opposition to any meaningful engagement with the UN. There were already complaints about the expense and how any convention shaped the relationship of the United States to refugees and therefore to its own immigration policy and to the stateless could heighten some of that anger or possibly deflect it. As soon as substantive discussion began, Henkin jumped in to urge bright-line distinctions between the problems of the refugees and the stateless. He feared confusion between the humanitarian problem of the refugees and the primarily legal problem of stateless persons. He was firm about distinguishing between stateless persons who were also refugees and stateless persons who were not refugees, that is, those people who stay put but borders change around them. Think the Kurds, for example, are people in that situation. The representatives from the UK and for France were more likely to emphasize the shared needs of refugees and of the stateless for personal status, property rights, the right of association, access to courts. The representative from France took very high ground. He wanted a fresh start made in connection with refugees in the spirit of the Universal Declaration. But generous spirit was something the United States feared. Henkin put it delicately. The persons coming under the draft convention would become protégés of the United Nations. They would thus constitute a responsibility of the United Nations, and the latter should take particular care whom it included in the scope of the draft convention. On the first afternoon, he introduced the draft of an article defining 4 categories of recognized refugees and carefully reminded them who was paying the bills. The extent of that responsibility must be known in advance. Too vague a definition, which would amount, so to speak, to a blank check, would not be sufficient. The representative from France recognized this. As everyone was aware, he said, the immense task carried out by the International Refugee Organization in the last 3 years has only been possible due to a great financial effort, largely provided by the United States, to which deepest gratitude is due. But he feared that the attitude of the U.S. government was probably due to financial considerations. No, says Henkin, it is not due to financial considerations, but to avoid the creation of insoluble administrative financial problems for the High Commissioner. And I don't think Henkin is, we are breathing hard. We are wishing that he was prepared to do a blank check, but we know realistically he couldn't do that, that in the political context of the United States, that was unrealistic. You read this and you read a tragedy. You read in those deliberations, you hear the tragedy playing out. As they decide not to automatically include an unlimited number of future refugees, or to extend international protection to any new group of refugees, or to stateless persons who are not refugees, we know that in 1950, those exclusions include the 500,000 Arab refugees being cared for by the United Nations Refugees and Works Administration. It excludes the Kashmiri and Indian refugees after 1948. It excludes many millions of Central and European refugees of Central and European origin living in Germany. I'm going to end this piece by, we can do questions later, but making the point that the Refugee Convention of 1951 remains a key document in international law. The refugee it imagined is one who emerged from the European experience of World War II. It continues to undergird choices in our own time, policy choices in our own time. Its definition, developed at such great pains for detail, remains the basic definition of the refugee. Any person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is outside the country of his nationality or unable or unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Its terms are lively. They are the 5 convention reasons. They have been absorbed into many law codes of many countries. Note that they do not include a person who fears persecution for reasons of gender. And courts have pretty reliably held to that understanding. In Canada, only 10 years ago, after much work, in a book that in which that work is detailed by Lisa Alfredson, in a recent book published maybe 2 years ago, asylum on the basis of fear directed at a person because of their gender is embedded now in the way Canada regards asylum claims, and the United States has only recently begun very gingerly and cautiously to recognize asylum claims on that matter. I have 10 minutes. I want to spend 5 on each of 2 topics. One is that as the ad hoc committee wrestled with the question of who would count as stateless in the aftermath of World War II, they found themselves in alliance, in interlinked engagement with the work of another committee that was also wrestling, had been for many years, with a related subject. Alas, there are no women primary delegates on the Committee on Refugees and Stateless Persons. It is left to the committee, the UN Committee on the Status of Women, which is a descendant of the League of Nations Committee of Experts on Women, to wrestle with the problem that is still percolating that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. The unstable nationality in many countries throughout the world of women who married men who did not have the nationality of their country. So that a woman who, until I think it was fixed in Egypt in 2004, is it? But it is good law in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia now, that if a woman who is a national of the country marries a stateless man, say a Palestinian, she loses her nationality and their children. She has no nationality to pass down to her children. I think Jordan has fixed some of this. Egypt fixed it. I think this is still true in Saudi Arabia. The UN Commission had the stability of married women's nationality as a primary concern. It had been a concern of feminists in the League of Nations back in the 1920s, when there was only one woman who was a regular delegate to the UN of any country. That was Kristin Hesselgren of Sweden, Norway. And all she managed to do, it's complicated, but get it into a committee which is formed in 1937 or something like that. So that it has to go out of business in 1938. But Dorothy Kenyon, the great American civil rights activist, learned her civil rights activism in some ways from these participations, was a member of the League Committee, and she lobbied hard to continue in the UN. She had hoped to be a member of the UN Committee on Human Rights, but Eleanor Roosevelt got to do that. So she got to be the American delegate to the Committee on Women, and she brought that issue with her. The story of the engagement of the women who sought to get the unstable nationality of married women central to the agenda of those who were worrying about of the men who were worrying about statelessness is a complicated and in some ways heartbreaking story. It will not appear in those conventions. It will appear considerably later and not enforceable as so many conventions are. I want to end by another node, or calling your attention to another space where these questions jump out for me from the category of historical experience a half century ago to contemporary experience now, and where they continue to percolate in our own politics and in our own sort of intellectual life. For the most part, the question of the birthright citizenship of children born on U.S. soil was settled by the 14th Amendment. It does not matter whether the children are born to a couple who is married or not married, legal or illegal, documented or undocumented. Any child born in the United States is a citizen at birth. It does matter, it did matter, in a long train of complex changes of the law, what the parentage was of a child born to one or two American citizens overseas. And by the 1950s, American women who married foreign men could reliably keep their own citizenship. So that question is solved. But at the same moment, the question of what was the citizenship of children born abroad to parents who were not married to each other, one of whom was an American citizen, was made even more problematic by being written into law in the Nationality Act of 1940 and then in the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. And there a distinction was made about whether the non-marital parent was a U.S. citizen mother or a U.S. citizen father. If the non-marital parent, where the father was a local national, was a U.S. citizen mother, and she had lived in the United States for only 1 year, then that child was a citizen at birth. If the U.S. citizen parent was the father, then there were a string of things that he had to meet, of requirements that he had to meet. He had to legitimize the child, had to pay child support until the child was 21. We've cut it down to 18. There were a number of other categories, one of which was that he had to have lived in the United States for 5 years after the age of 14. It used to be higher, but got lowered to 14. In a set of cases, Miller v. Albright in 1998, Nguyen versus the United Immigration and Naturalization Service in 2001, and Flores Villar. Well, in those first two cases, various aspects of these statutes were tested and found by Supreme Court majorities to be good law. They have not changed. One piece of it, the point of needing 5 years before you could pass, after the age of 14 in the United States, before you could pass down as a father citizenship to your non-marital child born abroad, was tested in the United States last fall by a man whose father had become his parent when the father was only 16 years old, and so could not have lived in the United States for more than 5 years after the age of 14. So the test was the catch-22, which Flores Villar's father could not meet, and therefore Flores Villar Jr. Could not be counted as a citizen. I went to watch the oral argument in that case. I mean, I found the case fascinating. I worked with the legal historian Kristen Collins on writing a historian's brief to be submitted in that case. I would say that also in the Department of Justice's position in this case, the Department of Justice submitted a brief which claimed that the reason for the disparity was to protect the children of American citizen women who had children born abroad, non-marital children born abroad, from the threat of statelessness, and that such a threat was not strong for the non-marital children of American men. In that case, a brief was submitted by a group of scholars. It's very hard. You know, you often don't know what category you are. These scholars were human rights. Some of them were lawyers, and they were specialists in human rights. I don't think they ever thought of themselves as scholars on statelessness, but that's what the brief calls itself because they have to make that claim. A brief that was submitted by scholars on statelessness who evaluated the nationality laws of dozens and dozens of countries across the globe and concluded that the threat of statelessness to non-marital children is not graver for the non-marital children of men than of women, and it varies a lot from country to country, and that the claim that it is greater for the non-marital children of women is not a persuasive claim. I went, as I started to say, to hear the argument in the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is an argument carried on by only 8 justices because Elena Kagan had to recuse herself, she having been Solicitor General at the time that the case came before the Ninth Circuit. So there are going to be 8 justices voting on it, and watching the case argued, there were 5 justices who made it clear that they were very, very, very skeptical of Flores Villar's claim. Court watchers would have predicted that the vote would be 5-3. So when it came down as a 4-4 claim decision without an opinion, we are left to conclude that one of the five shifted from the questions, the demeanor, the questions that he asked in court to being persuaded in some way by the questions and comments of the three justices who supported and seemed to find traction in Flores Villar's claim. And that there was a shift inside the court in order to get the 4. Given the kind of questioning that we heard, it is a fair, I think, I have no grounds really for this, but I think it is reasonable to guess that the shift was Justice Kennedy's shift, and it remains to be seen how the court will rule when this question comes before it again. But it's very unusual for the court to have, 3 cases testing a similar statute within 15 years, and everyone to be anticipating yet another issue of this. And so to those who think that statelessness belongs to the World War II generation, that its fears are ones that we can treat as antiquarians and as historians, I find myself, unfortunately, very unfortunately and with deep regret, concluding that it's very much on our own agenda.
Linda, could I ask a preliminary question just to get our historical bearings? Intense interest in the question of statelessness in the period of the wartime up to about the early 1950s. What I'm not clear on is whether it is relatively dormant until fairly recently, until the last decade, or whether there are certain points of continuity that run through the entire period for public and scholarly legal and historical interest.
Well, here in some ways I defer to Maureen. That is to say, the people interest and concern about refugees, I mean, there continue to be substantial numbers of refugees throughout the world, made so by, particular explosions, particular wars, and there are these are matters of real concern. I think that for the most part, U.S. historians who are not specialists in transnational fluidity, in the history of refugees, or who are not focusing on particular needy people at some moment or other, paid less attention to these matters than they should. But Maureen, when was Refugees International founded?
Microphone.
Wait, we need a mic.
We need the microphone.
You're absolutely right in saying that kind of the interest kind of peaks and comes in valleys over a period of time, and we've done some just a quick look at that in terms of media. But actually the UN General Assembly called some attention to the 1954 convention at that UNHCR should follow its mandate and follow through its particular activities. So somewhere in about the middle of the time between the 1954 convention and after the 1961 convention and up until the present time, there was a time when the UN General Assembly actually, called forth that the UN should kind of reactivate. And I would say it was probably in the mid-1990s-ish that this current interest really start to take off. There were some changes. There was a head of a statelessness unit at the UN, High Commissioner for Refugees, those kind of things. So there are various peaks and valleys to the issue.
I would say that I think one of our, I suspect there is I don't think the book exists, and therefore it's a dissertation dying to be written. We don't have a good history in English of the UNHCR. I mean, not one that is superficial, but one that engages it, that attempts to understand how under various heads, commissioners' priorities were set, work was done, money was raised, who supported it, and what were they able to do. And I've been struck, as I started reading its documents, that in recent years, the UNHCR's definition of what counts as a stateless person has shifted. And the way I try to explain it to people who are not specialists is that if you are Hannah Arendt, then it's a passport or not a passport. You can get out across a border or you can't get out across a border. And that still is true, but also you have people who have become stateless because the borders have changed around them, and sometime in the 90s, the UNHCR has to recognize that and start making its definition of who are people to whom it owes attention somewhat more complicated. Is that a fair thing to say?
Okay. Well, thank you, Linda, for this talk. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and as someone who was born to German parents and raised in Germany, but born here and hence has U.S. citizenship and the privilege to work in an institution like this, thought it was very personally touching. Thank you so much. We'll go, floor's open, first to Don.
Hi, Don Wolfensberger. I was fascinated at the outset when you mentioned the case of the fellow, the Angolan in Great Britain, I believe it was, Antonio Bravo, is that right? Mm-hmm. That his father had been expelled or deported from Angola because he was a liberationist, and now the father had died, committed suicide. The son is now, there's a case about his deportation back to Angola, I take it. Is that have anything to do with the fact that Angola since became independent? Or, to me, it just raised the whole issue of, does refugee status change when the status of the nation from which people have fled changes?
It's very interesting. As I understand it, he was not deported from Angola. He fled in fear of his life. But I don't know that. And it's an interesting question. In fact, one thing that this whole subject has made me think about is the basic question of what constitutes a nation, and forced me to read things about the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which is not something I ever thought that I would care about again after passing medieval history or early modern history. But there is in this subject that deep question, so that in one of the dissents, for example, in the Dred Scott decision, one of the justices of the Supreme Court says, in effect, Dred Scott can't have any standing because the slaves didn't come from a nation. They had no state from which to come. They came from, I don't know, tribes, kinship groups, whatever, but we don't have to respect, they are not backed by a nation that we need to respect. I have no idea whether that figures in this particular case. But it is one thing that we've heard the UNHCR has introduced into our language relatively recently is the concept not of so much the person with a nationality, the person who is stateless, but to think of effective nationality and ineffective nationality. So whether or not Antonio Bravo is stateless in an old-fashioned technical term, he still has nationality of Angola, whatever that means, but he certainly has ineffective nationality. As the son of his father, he comes back to Angola with no traction at all.
Okay. a number of people on my list, and I can see our time will run out quickly on this one. So,
I'll try to be quick.
Jim.
Linda, could I ask you to address the question of birthright citizenship? Is it possible to link up the challenge that has recently been raised to that here in the United States to the 1950s? And if so, what is the thread of connection, or is it something that has sprung up, out of the head of Zeus, fully formed right now? And also, perhaps it has a history that goes back to 1865. I mean, I just don't know. I'm just asking you for a brief rundown on the history of that.
Well, nice that you should mention it. 1868 first. Many people think that the promise of birthright citizenship, all persons born or naturalized, so forth, and they know, and they're absolutely right, is meant to stabilize the nationality of former slaves whom the southern states were trying, by hook or by crook, to restore to some kind of status which was effectively as bad as what they'd had. But in the course of the debates, there are moments where the question comes up, well, okay, in effect, okay, we understand this for black people, for former slaves, for freedmen. But what about the heathen Chinese? You can't possibly be meaning the heathen Chinese. And there is a wonderful moment someplace in those debates where Senator Lyman Trumbull, I like to think of him as channeling Dick Durbin, says, we did mean everyone. We do not, and this is something I think is also not well understood about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is not just about generosity. What he says is we do not want people in this country who do not owe allegiance to it. And we do not want to let strangers, we don't want multiple generations of the children of people who've found themselves here by accident or whatever, we don't want them not to be citizens because then they don't owe allegiance. And that's what we get from having a strong commitment to the 14th Amendment as it was written. And that, I think, is what a lot of people don't fully appreciate. On the 50s, you're on the mark. Question is, why make that distinction between the citizenship that is passed down by the American woman who's abroad and the citizenship of the non-marital child of the American man who's abroad? And Justice Kleinfeld, I believe, who is still on the Ninth Circuit, said in a case that was testing that provision, he said, well, 1952, we had a lot of soldiers in Korea causing babies to be born. Many do not like to pay child support if they can afford it. When that line was quoted in the oral argument in Nguyen, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg observed from the bench, there are some men out there being Johnny Appleseed, to the amusement of the audience, but it did not sway the court. So that I think it is not only fair to intuit, but it is explicitly on the record that that statute definitely makes clear the irresponsibility of American men abroad. The piece that is so striking to me is that now, even when DNA evidence was introduced in both Nguyen and in Flores, it has been ignored by the court. They're not going to change that approach, even in the face of DNA.
Mm-hmm. Lady over there. And please, everybody except Jim Banner, introduce yourself just quickly again.
Jan Lamberts. A methodological question. In your talk, you moved between specific U.S. cases and international cases, as well as the international community. And I just wanted to pin you down a little bit more closely. How important do you think the international community and these international cases ultimately will be in telling the specific U.S. story about this issue?
I'm trying real hard to tell the U.S. narrative, to readjust the U.S. narrative. I'm a beneficiary of a fresh deprovincialization of U.S. history that has reshaped our understanding of what counts as a U.S. narrative in the last, 20 years. And I think that the episode, which is, of course, longer and more complicated than I've been able to tell now, but the examples of Louis Henkin embedded in an international committee, Dorothy Kenyon embedded in an international committee, are excellent exemplars of the extent to which we cannot tell the U.S. narrative without its entanglements with the international community. I will try really hard not to try to write a history of global statelessness, but the fact of its presence and of its growth and of its resonance in the world in which we live is something that I hope to bring to heightened consciousness.
Thank you. Kenton?
Hi, I'm Kenton Clymer. And you've actually dealt with, in part, with the questions that I was going to raise. I was going to mention the Amerasian children that came out of the Vietnam War, of course, and that you mentioned the Korean prelude. The other question I have concerns birthright citizenship again. And I'm fully on your side on this, and I understand the magnificence of the 14th Amendment and all of that. I would guess that those who are advocating change would say, how many other countries have birthright citizenship? And I think the answer is very few. So why should we be as generous? And I think your Lyman Trimble comment speaks to that, but I wonder if you'd like to say more about that. How do we respond when people say, nobody else has birthright citizenship, why should we?
Just pass you the microphone down.
And then there was a question right there. It's a serious question. And it got more serious in, trying to think when, 2006 or 2007, when the UK ceased to, maybe a little earlier than that. After all, our tradition of birthright citizenship goes back to, what's his name's case with a C? This is a test. But at any rate, it goes back to when James VII of Scotland becomes James I of England, and the question becomes, what is the relationship of the Scottish subjects to the English crown? So that the practice of birthright citizenship, or unencumbered birthright citizenship, is one not that the U.S. invented, but one that has long been part of English tradition. So when the UK shifted from that in the early aughts to require that children born on their territory be children of legal immigrants, that pulls a big tablecloth out from our practice. We can no longer look to them. On the other hand, I think we make the case that I made, that there are major, major benefits to clinging to the practice and tradition of birthright citizenship that we do not contribute. I mean, the United States, we now understand the United States is not exceptional. There are very few ways in which we are exceptional. Well, this is one of them. We largely do not contribute to the substantial growth of stateless people in the world right now, whose numbers are rising, as you see to your horror as you read the reports of the UNHCR. I think we can be very proud of that. We don't have substantial subsequent generations of children whose nationality is in question, whose nationality is vague. There are states now that are trying to do that. I mean, Georgia's recent law and so forth. I think we can say that. There are still some Latin American countries in which birthright citizenship is clear. And so we're not alone, but it is true that we need to make our own justification for it. We can't lean on others.
I'm Robert Baum here from the Wilson Center. Let me say this spoke to me very personally since my grandmother was one of those who lost her citizenship. She became a German national in 1906, having never been to Germany when she married my grandfather, and didn't get it back until 1914 when he was worried about troubles in Europe and keeping his ability to stay in the U.S. But I wanted to ask a question on a very different point, which is the issue of gender refugee status. I've done a little bit of expert testimony about West African women fleeing genuine fears of forced marriage and forced genital cutting. And it seems that part of the problem is that this is a persecution at the hands, in many cases, of parents of children. And there's a reluctance, I think, in law to intervene in those relationships unless you can truly prove an abusive relationship. But there's also a failure, I think, to understand the lack of government institutions in many countries, and not just in West Africa, that are reluctant or unwilling to intervene in these areas, and that women who defy this have very few elements of local recourse. And I was wondering, my question is, to what extent within the history of American legal tradition or in international law are there grounds for expanding that right and understanding that complex relationship between family persecution and the lack of government intervention on behalf of these children?
It's important, very important. I'm not a lawyer, but I think there are two pieces of the response that might be useful to say. One is, and I learned this from heavily from Lisa Alfredson's book about Canada, and also about from the work of Kristen Morallo and her work on refugee women in the United States. There's a case book that she wrote, and she's been active in the defense, the asylum claims of some such women, that the claim can be made that there are certain crimes that we will regard inside the United States as crimes. And so then the question is, should we not offer asylum? Is it not reasonable to offer asylum to people who are fleeing actions which in their own countries are not regarded as crimes, but in our country are, and to expand the grounds for such asylum? The other, and if there are family lawyers here that would help, it's my understanding that in family law, as practiced in the United States, there are agreements that are made in families of other countries, other cultures, that will not be respected when they're brought to U.S. courts here. The marriage of underage, arranged marriages for children, arranged by two sets of agreeing families who are in the United States, will not be recognized by U.S. courts. Certain prenuptial agreements made in the country of origin, brought to the United States and claimed by a divorcing partner in the United States, will not be recognized in U.S. courts. So I think we certainly have some grounding in the law that's strong and clear for not being pushovers, if you were, or relativists, not assuming that every such action must be regarded, as relativist. My colleague Ann Eston in family law has written extensively about some of this, and I know there's a world of experts on that.
Thank you. We have two final questions. We'll take them, at once, and then Linda has the remaining few minutes to respond to both. So first.
My name is Tatiana Indina. I'm Fulbright visiting scholar here in Woodrow Wilson Center from Moscow, Russia. Thank you, Linda, for a very important work that you do. For Russia, problems of migrants are also very actual and sharp. But my question probably does not concern the exact topic of your research, but still it would be very interesting to hear your opinion on the status of Native American population in America and which relationship does the current American government have with Native Americans, which problems and challenges you can define here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dorothy Bork. Hold on, microphone.
Oh, okay. Linda, what you were saying about the 14th Amendment and the rationale for it, Trumbull's rationale, and I think it was very much there. We don't want people who owe no allegiance to the United States. What's striking with the difference now of this issue arising is that there seems to be taken for granted that we can deport these people. Mm-hmm. They are being, and indeed they are being deported under the current administration in considerable, and under previous one, in considerable numbers back to their so-called country of origin. And it's ironic when you think of the contrast with 1868 having given up the notion of colonization, finally, that we could deal with the issue of the freedmen by somehow removing them to some other place, that this is occurring. Partly it's the numbers, it's the relative, many of these people go back to Latin America or Mexico, the relative proximity of the country and so on. There are other conditions at work. But isn't that that would be a big factor now, I think. Mm-hmm. And when did deportation appear in this story as a possible out? As a possible kind of way of just cutting off the connection.
And I cannot turn down Anna Nelson,
yeah, no, you
who
can't.
has
Don't
been
you dare.
yes. So I'm going to give her the final word. Hold on, microphone, Anna.
I just want to ask Linda about some of her problems of research, which I think would interest everybody in the room. I mean, she's not a 20th century historian, and yet she had to go out and put together really rather obscure information, find it. And so, a couple of minutes of how you attacked that would, I think, interest all of us.
Okay, first let me do these two,
and
then I'll say something, and then I'll beg for help and advice. On Native Americans. When one way to think about the relationship with Native Americans is that, and I should say that in the former Soviet Union, we both know that there were people who got left out as borders got drawn, and so there are some major statelessness problems there. The way I think of it, and I'm not an expert on this, but try to ground it, at the times very early on, and in fact, what's his name? Fred Hoxie wrote a wonderful book, which is a history of the United States through the eyes of Native Americans. So it's an alternate narrative. And in it, someplace, he offers the counterfactual question, what would the history of the United States be like if the treaties with American Indian tribes that were framed in the founding era had been, in fact, respected? There are these treaties. They look like treaties with other nations, with real nations. What would what would have followed if they had been treated as though they were real nations? What happened? So there's a moment, I think, when we could say they are real nations. And then the moment sometimes when John Marshall calls them domestic dependent people, but sometime in the 1830s for sure, the United States takes the position they're not quite real nations. And then I would say the way I like to think about it is we have a very complex period in which sometimes Aboriginal people are treated as though they are other nations with whom we make treaties which for a while we respect, and sometimes and pretty quickly we don't. And then in bits and pieces, they become embraced one way or another, sometimes because they want to be, sometimes because they don't want to be, as U.S. citizens. And so by the, 1924, they are named U.S. citizens, but whether they get the rights and privileges and so forth of being U.S. citizens is its own history. But they work for my purposes in that I would say there's a period when where it's fair to regard them as another nation. There's a period now when they are citizens like other citizens and have to lobby for what they want within it and make claims on their own behalf. And one of those claims I remember about the time they were framing the Museum of the American Indian was there was either one tribe or an amalgam tribe that wanted to establish a diplomatic headquarters in Washington. And then in between that long period in the 19th century, I think there are long periods where Native Americans could be appropriately regarded as stateless. As for the deportation, there are historians of that. There's a very fine book by Daniel Castrom called Deportation Nation. Lucy Salyer is working on the subject of deportation in the United States, and so quite remarkably is Matt Gibney at the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford. One big sort of moment of deportation is of naturalized American citizens who were originally German and who, in the heightened hysteria about Germans, were denationalized and then deported. So deportation is also related to a history of denationalization. And the piece of that question, which is worth thinking about as one thinks about it in larger terms, is a piece that Jacqueline Baba has written about with great power and has litigated with real power, and that is that think about the braceros who had work visas in the 50s and who were eventually sent back to Mexico. When you talk now about giving people temporary work visas, think about this one. So they are sent back to Mexico, and their citizen children must go with them because they're kids, and who is going to take care of them? And that happened in Postville, in the Postville, Iowa raids. It's happening in all of those immigration raids now in which the deportations are also deporting citizen children. Jackie Baba and some other litigants, people who actually litigate some of these cases, have been, Caroline Sawyer in the UK, have been trying to articulate, to think about arguments by which the presence of a U.S. citizen child in a family would not protect the parents completely against deportation, but could be in some way a factor to be taken in account by the judiciary in making its decisions about that. So was I supposed to do anything else?
Anna.
Oh, about research. Well, as Erin knows, it's hapless. Some of the research is very traditional, rereading of familiar texts with a different eye. so that I had read Hannah Arendt's Origin of Totalitarianism when Jim and I were babies and desperately preparing for orals. I read chapter 9 of the Origins with a whole new, understanding when I read it being much older and with another set of concerns. And that's true for a lot of what I'm doing, is the very traditional stuff. But a lot of what I'm doing is challenging me in all kinds of ways that are unfamiliar. The end of this book has to be about, or toward the end, has to be about trafficked women, whom the UNHCR now regards as people with, or trafficked labor is something like 85% of which are women in domestic labor, read sex work, whom the UNHCR has recently agreed to regard as people with ineffective nationality. Once again, I thought this was not necessarily part of the U.S. story, and then I discovered that 33 states have statutes against trafficked labor because 33 states have had the experience of trafficked women through them, or trafficked people. So that's another place where these things overlap, and where I need to learn sort of the sociology of it. I ask sociologists questions. And then for the part where I'm trying to dope out what it meant to be Lou Henkin, 33 years old, told we are not going to sign this, but yet we want you, in your inexperience, to shape something that the U.S. can live with, even if it's not going to sign it. I want to understand that. And for that, I need guides through the very complex record groups in the National Archives, and it's hard. And the way I think about it is that years ago on the AHA Women's Committee, when we were, Dorothy Ross and I and some others, in our 30s, and some very senior scholars were telling us that we didn't know what we were talking about and that we were young and, marginal, and we should not be so serious about what we wanted. One of our members said to us, who was a bit older, a bit more experienced, said to us, those guys, how many of them have written one book? Well, we had written one book too, so that was okay. How many of them have written 2 books? How many of them have written 3 books? How many of them have written 4 books, and they're all the same book? This ain't the same book. And when I despair, that's what I cling to.
Thank you so much, Professor Kerber, for a most fascinating and inspiring afternoon. Thank you.